Lucasfilm boss Kathleen Kennedy says a lot of women in Disney Star Wars struggle with fan attacks because of the fan base being so male-dominated.
And the Disney stock just keeps going down and down and down. And then Bob Iger is all like, no, what's going on with my stocks? No, Kathleen Kennedy.
If Disney ever plans on making money with the Star Wars franchise they spent so much shareholder capital acquiring, then might I suggest they send Kathleen Kennedy back to fetching coffee for George, Stephen, Frank, and Richard with a gag in her mouth. Renegade Online. Well, folks, welcome back. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's good to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many watching this video, not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment and turn that little red subscribe button to gray. Hit that like button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias, and of course, please do leave a comment before you head out the door today. Make sure to join us every Sunday afternoon and Wednesday afternoon at 6 p.m. Eastern right here for the live shows. This story hit the wires yesterday, saying that Kathleen Kennedy, the Lucasfilm Disney Star Wars boss, said a lot of women in Star Wars struggle with the fan attacks because the fan base is so male-dominated. Now, this was a Variety article that stemmed from a New York Times interview on the Acolyte with both Leslye Headland and Kathleen Kennedy. Let's take a look at that one. Apart from the typical pomp and circumstance that opens an article fluffing folks like Leslye Headland and Kathleen Kennedy, we get to some of the meat and potatoes in here about the Acolyte and some of the comments that came from Kathleen Kennedy. But let's start here. Leslye Headland's show, by the way, former personal assistant to convicted felon Harvey Weinstein, Leslye Headland, the Acolyte will debut on Disney Plus on June 4th, costing roughly $180 million. That's for 8 episodes. Now, again, I don't know where that figure is coming from. That may have been something that was divulged by Leslye Headland. We do not have all the financial reporting in for that yet. It's probably going to be another year or so before we see the final tally, maybe even longer than that. But I have a feeling it's going to come in higher than $180 million. It took 4 years to make. It attempts 2 feats at once, the article says, pleasing old school Star Wars fans, right, who seem unpleasable while telling an entirely new story, one that requires no prior knowledge of Star Wars and that showcases women and people of color. Let's review that line one more time. They're saying this show accomplishes 2 feats. It tells a Star Wars story, which it is a Star Wars story, so that seems like it's kind of built in. But the other amazing feat is that it involves women and people of color. What have we been saying about this show since the outset? What is Disney, Leslye Headland, Kathleen Kennedy, and everybody else, all the women running Lucasfilm into the ground, been saying about this show from the beginning? This will be the most diverse and representative Star Wars of all time. This will be the first Star Wars product or TV show or film to feature a trans character, as it's been stated now. Is everybody excited yet? I'm sure you are. I'm not sure why automatically women and people of color and a trans character is going to make this such a great show, but apparently the folks at Lucasfilm seem to think so. For the faithful, the Acolyte serves up scads of Jedi, a franchise fundamental that the other live-action Star Wars TV shows have depicted sparingly or not at all. The opening scene in The Acolyte takes place in an eatery crowded with colorful aliens, a callback to the Mos Eisley Cantina from the first Star Wars movie in 1977. Other shout-outs to core fans, "We see you, we haven't forgotten about you," they say, are sprinkled into the dialogue. Things like, "May the Force be with you," and "I have a bad feeling about this" makes an early appearance.
Remember TIE fighters? Oh, remember Jawas? Remember Mos Eisley? Remember the Rancor? Remember Sand People? Remember the Cantina?
At the same time, the Acolyte embraces what some people call new Star Wars, or just maybe Disney Star Wars, an era defined by diversity and expansion beyond the Skywalker saga, which started with Disney's purchase of the franchise in 2012. Amanda Stenberg stars as a dreadlocked warrior who has a complicated relationship with a Jedi Master played by Lee Jung-jae from Squid Game. The Acolyte also breaks new ground behind the camera. While women have directed episodes of shows like The Mandalorian and Obi-Wan Kenobi, Headland, age 43, is the first to create a Star Wars series. To be fair, was Deborah Chow not the showrunner for the entire Obi-Wan series? Have you picked up also so far in this article how many moments of attention are called to diversity and to ethnic and gender issues that are involved with this show? Like, this is some big deal. Once again, this is the reason that you should watch the show. And then later come the comments from Kennedy, which really make all of this 10 times worse. From the second that any new Disney Star Wars project comes into public view, Disney announced The Acolyte in 2020. Fans claw for information and pick apart what they find. It's part of what makes Star Wars so powerful. People care. And the problem is not near enough of them care anymore because they're not watching these shows or spending money on it. Attention also creates problems. Rumor can solidify into fact. Some Star Wars obsessives, for instance, have worried that Headland's show breaks canon or tinkers with already established storylines in the franchise, the ultimate Star Wars crime. It does not, proclaims the New York Times. Here's an interesting tidbit. Leslye wanted this show to be accessible. No homework needed before watching, said Jocelyn Bio, the Ghanaian-American writer. Headland added Bio to the writing team for The Acolyte specifically because she was not a Star Wars devotee. She asked me what I knew about Star Wars, and my answer was, Harrison Ford runs around space with a giant dog? And Leslye said, you're hired. Can I point out how well this has worked for Kathleen Kennedy, her team, the women at Lucasfilm, and Disney since 2012? The first Acolyte trailer, released in March, racked up 51.3 million views in its first 24 hours, a record for any live-action Star Wars series, including The Mandalorian, according to Lucasfilm. Yeah, I'm sorry, are we talking about the trailer that now has about 710,000 downvotes on it, at least just for the U.S. Star Wars-based YouTube page, with merely 194,000 upvotes on 10 million views? Yeah, I realize that this trailer is out in other channels as well, not just the one Star Wars page, but they have Star Wars UK in different places like this. In different places, they drop the trailer. But just look at this ratio. This should tell you that people aren't watching this trailer because they're necessarily excited about it. They're actually watching this trailer to come in and downvote it and then drop some very colorful comments. But dismissing the record number of views this trailer got for a moment, the article does actually pick up on what we were just talking about a little bit. But a loud, primordial part of the Star Wars fandom has pushed back in predictable fashion. Why are there so many women, girls, and minority characters increasingly dominating the ranks of the Jedi? Reads a comment on the Acolyte trailer, with others expressing a similar worldview. And to be clear, it's not that we're having a diverse cast in the sense of gender and ethnicity in Star Wars. It's the fact that people realize why it's happening. This is part of a forced plan by Disney that they're doing across the board in all their studios. There's nothing terribly organic about any of this. They actually have a corporate directive from places like the Stories Matter Group and Reimagine Tomorrow, two very powerful diversity, equity, and inclusion departments that burn through hundreds of millions of dollars of shareholder capital probably in the last 10 years since they've been around to create this kind of stuff forcibly. It's a version of the same misogyny and racism that greeted Rey, the female Jedi played by Daisy Ridley, who made her debut in The Force Awakens in 2015, and that drove Kelly Marie Tran off social media when she appeared in The Last Jedi in 2017. I don't know about you, but the only racism and sexism that I remember from Disney Star Wars are the components that the women of Lucasfilm put into the sequel trilogy. In other words, the way that they treated the men in the sequel trilogy. Or how about the way they treated the black man in the sequel trilogy? Does everybody remember Finn? Remember what everybody was hoping for him to be? Maybe we would get a Jedi that would come from a stormtrooper. Nobody really cared that he was black. And then the women of Lucasfilm turned him into a clown show in the second and third movie, destroying his character so much so that the actor decided never to have anything to do with Star Wars again, at least until this point. And let's not forget the way they treated the white men in the movie. Luke and Han were both turned into old piece of garbage losers. So who's actually the victim here when it comes to racism and misogyny? Is it the women of color that you're putting in here? Or was it the actual original Star Wars characters and even some of the new characters that you, Disney and Kathleen Kennedy, created and then did what you did to them? And you wonder where the audience went. Kathleen Kennedy, who runs Lucasfilm, has also experienced this victimhood with South Park.
Is there a problem, people?
Harshly attacking her in an episode last year. The cartoon depicted Kennedy giving the same feedback to Star Wars creators over and over.
Put another gay diverse woman in it. Make it more f***ing lame.
Some trolls have nicknamed Headland's Acolyte the Wokeolite. In a brief telephone interview, Kennedy's support for the Acolyte was steadfast. My belief is that storytelling does need to be representative of all people, she said. That's an easy decision for me. Except the Force is female. Your whole mantra since coming to the Walt Disney Company and running Lucasfilm into the ground has been to expand it, to make it diverse, because you didn't want to cater to the older white men in the beginning. You know, the people that actually drove the overwhelming bulk of financial returns for the Star Wars intellectual property. No, you wanted to dump on them. You wanted to deconstruct and destroy their heroes. You wanted to subvert their expectations and have everything they loved replaced with things that did not represent them, because you wanted more representation for yourself, a stand-in character for yourself, Kathy, namely Rey. And then comes the money quote. Operating within these giant franchises now with social media and the level of expectation, it's terrifying, Kathleen Kennedy continued. I think Leslye has struggled a little bit with it. I think a lot of the women who step into Star Wars struggle with this a bit more. Because of the fan base being so male-dominated, they sometimes get attacked in ways that can be quite personal. So even in 2024, Kathleen Kennedy understands that the fan base is very male-dominated, and yet she persists in trying to replace all of their heroes that they paid for decades on end with weaker female characters. And by weaker, I mean, frankly, poorly written, like Rey, a Mary Sue that didn't even come close to representing what Luke Skywalker did in the first 3 films. As a fan myself, I know how frustrating some Star Wars storytelling in the past has been, Leslye Headland said, declining to cite some specific examples. Quote, I've felt it myself. Do y'all ever notice that every time we get these reports of feeling victimized or racism or sexism, all of these folks, especially in related to Lucasfilm projects, we never seem to get much, if any, in terms of actual evidence. You know the old phrase of show the receipts? They never seem to have any receipts. And now we get to one of the most amazingly idiotic, self-contradictory things I've ever seen in a single article. She followed up with a text message. Quote, I stand by my empathy for Star Wars fans, she wrote. But I want to be clear, anyone who engages in bigotry, racism, or hate speech, I don't consider a fan. And then it goes on to say Star Wars projects aren't known for personal or idiosyncratic filmmaking. The production and marketing budgets are simply too high. The storytelling must appeal to the widest possible audience to make the numbers work. Let that sink in for a minute. Rian Johnson, who directed The Last Jedi in 2017, told the New York Times that he didn't even try to put his own stamp on the franchise. It would be bad news if you came into this saying, how do I make this mine? Rian said. How was that not his? Kathleen Kennedy, however, pushed Leslye Headland to do just that with The Acolyte. You've written a great Star Wars show, Kathy told her, Leslye Headland, in 2019 in response to early scripts. Quote, now go write a Leslye Headland show. Let's read a couple of key quotes again. Because the fan base is so male-dominated, they sometimes get attacked in ways that can be quite personal. Talking about the female directors and actors in the new Kathleen Kennedy Disney Star Wars. And then again, Star Wars projects aren't known for personal or idiosyncratic filmmaking. The production and marketing budgets are simply too high. The storytelling must appeal to the widest possible audience to make the numbers work. That's something the New York Times said. And then Kathleen Kennedy tells Leslye Headland, go write a Leslye Headland show for Star Wars. See, a lot of these left-wing publications keep putting pieces of all the puzzle together in some of the same articles like this one, but they never can seem to put the picture together. The very problem with Star Wars, the reason it's been an abject failure for the Walt Disney Company, since they bought it in 2012, with maybe a few outlying exceptions like The Mandalorian and some of the associated merchandise sales, or The Force Awakens, the first movie, because people didn't know what to expect. But everything since then, once people got a taste of what was to come, it's fallen flat. And the only thing still holding it together are sales and licensing from classic Star Wars, the original real George Lucas stuff. But what these journalists can't seem to piece together is that, yes, it's a male-dominated audience. It always has been. And that's not to say that women have never loved Star Wars. They have, and they do, just to nowhere near the same numbers. And if you have to appeal to the broadest audience possible, then it's simple. You have to appeal to the broadest audience that you already have built in, which is a male-dominated audience. And when you have somebody running a studio like Kathleen Kennedy, who puts her own personal desires ahead of actual profit making in a publicly traded company, you have a serious problem, because she's the one that started the Force is female. We need to have more women in Star Wars. We need to do this and that. And she did it at the expense of the male-dominated audience that she herself acknowledges still exists. She knows that it's still a male-dominated audience that drives the viewership and the money train of Star Wars, and she still refuses to actually cater to them. And that's not a bad thing, but in her mind, it is. And when you keep denigrating and destroying male heroes in Star Wars, you're going to keep losing the male audience, and the male audience is going to keep snapping back at you. So, Kathy, from me to you, stop playing the victim. You're not the victim. We are. The Star Wars fandom. We are the victim. Disney shareholders are the victims. You are the perpetrator. This right here, Kathleen Kennedy, is what happens when you hand somebody something they didn't build and ask them to just run with it. Kathleen Kennedy, as we've said many times, would not be where she is today without the guys like Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Richard Donner, and even her own husband, Frank Marshall, having put her in this position. It's not because she's a woman. The same thing could have happened to a guy or anybody out there. But in this case, Kathleen Kennedy constantly complaining about the men that put her where she is, in the position that she is, not going along with her new vision of things when she doesn't know what she's doing, and playing the victim is going to constantly be a problem for the Walt Disney Company. And until somebody gets a handle on this, nothing's going to change. If Disney actually wants to see Star Wars be successful, then they're going to have to cater to that male-dominated audience that for the last 12 years, Kathleen Kennedy has been trying to absolutely destroy. Make sure you're subscribed to Valiant Renegade and join us every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the live show.